everybody has some form of a shortcoming. A shortcoming is something that makes you fall short of expectation, or fall short of a standard, or fall short of your own desires. So that shortcoming can keep you from a big thing that God wants to do in your life. It can be a dream, it can be a vision, it can be a desire, and a shortcoming can make you feel inadequate for the things that God wants you to do. So today we're going to learn how to overcome the shortcoming. And we're going to look at a man who had shortcomings but tried to rise above them. And his name is Zakos. And his story is in Luke's Gospel, chapter 19, and from verses 1 to 10. Luke chapter 19, 1 to 10. But I will be reading from verse 1 to 6, just for time's sake. So Luke chapter 19, and I read from verses 1 to 6. Then Jesus entered and passed through Jericho. Now behold, there was a man named Zakos, who was a chief tax collector, and he was rich. And he sought to see who Jesus was, but could not because of the crowd, for he was of short stature. So he ran ahead and climbed up into a sycamore tree to see him, for he was going to pass that way. And when Jesus came to the place, he looked up and saw him and said to him, Zacchaeus, make haste and come down, for today I must stay at your house. So he made haste and came down and received him joyfully. The story of Zacchaeus sometimes appears almost comical, because you can imagine the height of the man and his sense of activity and the whole effort of climbing up, and Jesus seeing him, and then later on when you read his whole attitude. Zacchaeus seemed to be a very fun-loving, outgoing personality and very energetic. He was a very colorful character. Now I'm going to use the story of Zacchaeus like a metaphor for how we rise above our shortcomings. And we're going to walk through the steps he took to rise above his shortcomings. Zacchaeus lived in Jericho, and he was a chief tax collector or tax officer. He was rich. He was a quick thinker. He was active. He was outgoing, had a cheerful personality. And all that energy was bundled in a small body. Zacchaeus was short. Interestingly, his name Zacchaeus means pure. That's what his name meant, pure. So by name, he was expected to be pure, but by his actions, he was seen as not pure by the Jews. And people didn't have a very good thought or consideration of him. Unlike the three people we spoke about last week who were paralyzed and couldn't move and needed help, Zacchaeus could move. He could walk, he could run, and he was an active person. He was not paralyzed. But he had shortcomings. And he had two main shortcomings. The first one was his reputation. He had a bad reputation. He was a chief tax collector. Tax collecting is generally a noble job in current times, although none of us like tax collectors. But it's a noble job to be a tax collector. You have to be an accountant sometimes and to be able to do that. But to the Jews of Jesus' time, tax collecting was not a good job. It was hated. And that's why Zacchaeus had a reputational problem. People didn't like him, and that was a shortcoming for him. We'll find out soon. Because tax collectors in the days of Jesus were contractors who worked for the Roman government. And the Roman government was oppressing the Jewish people. And the tax collectors were picked among the Jews. And normally they'll be given a quota of taxes they must collect. So if you collected tax in a neighborhood, you were told you must collect so much taxes. Now the tax collector, in order to make money, had to collect the quota and then collect beyond the quota, because everything above the quota is for the tax collector. And so people didn't like them because they squeezed money out of the Jews. And that's what Zacchaeus was doing. And actually he was a chief tax collector, not just a tax collector. That means that he had employed other people in various locations who went out, harassed people, collect taxes from them, and he was sitting on top of this big pyramid. And because of that, his reputation was very low. People didn't like him. And when people don't like you in a community, you may go ahead with your life and enjoy your life, but there comes a time when reputation may go against you. His second shortcoming was his stature. So he had a problem with reputation. He had a problem with his stature. He was limited in height. He was not a tall person. And he couldn't be blamed for his height. He didn't make himself short. He was born that way. Probably his parents were short, so he inherited that limitation. His reputation as a tax collector, he didn't inherit. He chose it. His reputation, his stature as short was inherited. What does that tell you? Sometimes shortcomings are inherited. You're just born that way. That's who you are. And sometimes it's a result of choices you made. So whether it's choices you made or who you are, you were just born that way, it's still a shortcoming. It's still a shortcoming. And ordinarily, when we look at Zacchaeus, the Bible calls him a rich person. So it means that he had found a way to manage his shortcomings. People didn't like him, but didn't bother him. He still moved on and made money. He had limited height, didn't bother him. You don't need height to collect money. So he did well. His shortcomings didn't seem like shortcomings. Then one day, all of these things that he had managed so well to handle so well in his life came against him, because he heard of Jesus. And he wanted to see Jesus. The passage says he sought to see who Jesus was. Because sometimes, you can be okay with a shortcoming because you can manage it well. Probably maybe your shortcoming is you don't speak good English. And you can manage it well if everybody you trade with doesn't speak good English. Or you just don't need English to trade until the day when you need English to trade. Or you have some other shortcoming that you're able to manage well until something comes up where you realize you can't manage it. And for Zacchaeus, that day came when Jesus came to Jericho, came to town, and he sought to see Jesus. Something interesting about Zacchaeus is that although the man doesn't have a good reputation, people don't like him. He seems like a crook. He seems like somebody who is just taking advantage of people. Deep inside his heart, he had a love for God. He had a spiritual desire. And it seems like this spiritual desire was a very big desire of his. There are people who can seem very rough on the outside, but deep inside them, they have a deep hunger for God. And that's what Zacchaeus was. He had a deep hunger for God. Nobody knew him as a person who loved God. He seemed to love money more than God. He seemed not to care about anybody until Jesus came that way. And then his true desires showed up, and he sought to see who Jesus was. That's when he had the challenge. The The first challenge he had was a hostile crowd. The crowd was hostile to him. They disliked his reputation. They didn't like him mingling with them. And so if he was going to be with that crowd, people would say, hey, Zacchaeus, you don't belong here. You're a bad man. You're not supposed to be in this crowd. It's almost like when there are some people who go to church and people ask, are you in church? Well, how did you come to this church? Well, because people think you don't belong to church. And that's what they thought about Zacchaeus. He doesn't belong to the Jesus crowd. That's his first shortcoming. How do you survive in a crowd when the crowd is hostile against you? How do you survive in a place where people don't like you? How do you survive in an office where people dislike you? How do you survive when the crowd is hostile? Because sooner or later, some of us find ourselves in places where people don't like us for whatever reason. So that's the first thing. The crowd is hostile because of his reputation. Secondly, it's a hindering crowd. They hindered him. How did they hinder him? They were taller than him. Everybody who seemed to be taller than him, they stood in his way and hindered him from seeing Jesus. So the crowd is hostile to him and the crowd is hindering him. Sometimes we feel that way. We're strong, we're active, we have gifts, we have talent. Everything seems to be going on for us. And then you get into another season in your life where your shortcomings kick in. Hostility, hindrance. So, how do you deal with it? How does Zacchaeus deal with this? Well, he understood his shortness, but he didn't allow his shortness to shorten him. Because, my friends, sooner or later, you're going to have a dream. And that dream is going to make all your shortcomings appear. You're going to be invited to a boardroom and then you've realized you're not prepared. Your language is not good. You're going to be invited to a place and then you realize your education doesn't match up. You're supposed to submit a report and you don't know how to write a report. You're supposed to do something great and then you realize, I don't have what it takes. For some of us, our big desire is, I want to live for God like Zacchaeus. Other people will say, I want to have a great marriage. Or I want to get married. Or I want to set up a business. Or I want to be financially independent. Or I just want to be happy. These are very simple desires, but these desires, like Zacchaeus' desire to see Jesus, can sometimes be very difficult to achieve because your shortcomings will come against it. So sometimes you want to live for God, but you have a lot of past and current entanglement. And I hope you know what I mean by entanglement. All kinds of things, relationships and entanglement are making it difficult for you to live for God. So that's your shortcoming. Your past associations, maybe a past boyfriend, a past girlfriend, relationships you are in, entanglements, and they are hindering you from seeing God. That's your shortcoming.
We've come to the end of this video. We believe you've been blessed. Remember, God's love is steadfast and unchanging. May His grace and peace be with you always. If you're new here, consider subscribing to stay up to date with our videos. Kindly share this video with your friends and families. You can watch this next video on your screen.